Greetings, lords and ladies. Getting rolling here. Just making sure everything's set up properly. And we'll get going in just a few minutes. Judah's going to be joining me. Make sure everything is functioning properly. If you see me, let me know if there's any sound problems, etc., etc. We're going to be talking Game of Thrones today. I meant for this podcast to not be anything related to current pop culture. But a lot has happened with the show, and there's a lot of controversy on the internet. And while the last thing I want this channel to become, or this podcast to become, is chasing controversy, I think there's some pretty interesting stuff to talk about with Game of Thrones, and I've been paying attention to it for a while. So I thought I would chime in with some thoughts, and this episode's kind of going to be a hypothesis. My thoughts about what the show's legacy will be, what the book's legacy will be. And so we'll see if when I revisit it in the future, because we're rewatching the whole show. So if when I revisit it in the future, if I still agree, that's kind of the goal for today, is to see if what I'm saying today holds up to scrutiny a year from now, once the show is all done and we have the benefit of hindsight. And I will be talking with some friends. Last week we had a podcast, Reverse Redaction, in which we talked a lot about Game of Thrones. Mainly we talked about season 8 and what's been going wrong with it. And the points have been so belabored at this point. I feel like we're just like another set of voices. Greetings, good morning. But I do want to talk about some of the ideas that I'm going to be put forward today about Game of Thrones, and kind of rehash them over the course of the next few weeks with friends and people who are big fans of it. My brother-in-law, for instance, like, he's a diehard fan of the books, and I'm really curious to hear what he's thought of the overall scope of the show. There was things that he wasn't the biggest fan of, like the etymology of Hodor's name, for instance. So I'll be curious to... Oh, hold on. Let me get Judah in here 1 second. So I hope everyone's having a good Saturday morning. It's going to be nice and intellectually stimulating, hopefully. Let me share this. No. So we'll get going just a second here. Pretty soon, we're just going to have a whole wall. The screen is going to be your wall. Monitors are just not enough anymore. Got 3 and it's still not enough. Still not enough room. That question. Yeah, I'm not going to deal with that today at all. I won't set foot near that question with a 100-mile pole. We are about 100 miles away from Alabama. Not quite 100 miles. Probably less, actually, yeah. 70, maybe. We're basically South Alabama and North Florida. But maybe one day I'll address that. We are going to talk a bit about politics, but through the lens of Game of Thrones today. All right. Almost ready to go here. How's everyone doing this morning? It's been a fairly busy week for me. Last week I had a 57-hour work week. This week was less. So, a little less crazy. Greetings, lords and ladies, on the old Facebook. Hello, everyone. Oh, there he is. Greetings, sir. And how are you this morning? I've got a little bit of echo. Is that me or is that you? Oh, I'm sorry. I've got something messed up. Hold on. Jeez. Louise. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. All right. Where am I? What am I? Okay. Okay, yes, here we go, sir. Greetings, Bhai Saab. Pretty good. So, how's your week been? Yeah? Hmm. Interesting. You're in a different location, sir? Oh, an undisclosed location. Okay. uh, you can't hear Judah. Talk, Judah. My desktop audio is not working. That is really weird. Thank you for telling me that, Improbable One. Appreciate it. Strange. That is really weird. It's not showing through at all. I may have to go offline and come back on, guys. OBS must not be working right because all the settings are proper, aren't they? The 21. All right, guys. I'm going to have to go offline and come back on. Sorry for this. We'll see in just a second.
The Chinese chicken?
I have a drumstick and your brain starts clicking. Okay, it's back. Yes, it was. I'd switched my audio settings in midstream. You can't do that. So.
Oh.
Yeah, you can't do that. Don't switch your audio settings midstream. It'll mess it up.
Are we back live?
We're back live. So let me know. Go ahead and comment away if you're available or around. Peoplings. Give me a sound check on that. Sorry about the technical difficulty.
Yeah, and make sure.
Make sure. What? Hello? Are you there?
Okay, yeah.
Okay, good. All right, we're gonna jump right into it. Philip DeFranco has created a meme that will never die now, because now PewDiePie starts every single video with "Let's just jump into it."
It's let's just jump right into
it. So here we go. Saturday morning, time for pseudo intellectual drivel with the surfing violins. Brace yourself, lords and ladies. Okay, are you ready for this, Judah?
I don't know.
I don't know. I shared the document with you. You got it?
Okay.
So
Yeah.
you can follow along. Judah gets the prerogative to follow along.
That's the only reason I'm doing this. I get the sneak peek.
All right, here we go. Set. Thousands of years ago, or so the story goes, a tribal leader who had been bestowed with divine favor was told that members of his tribe were speaking for God without his permission. Not in the holy place and not in the leader's presence, but in their very own tents and common areas. How profane to mingle the holiness of God with the rabble and dust of a tent city. An enterprising master of whispers thought that letting the leader know about this potentially treasonous act would curry favor with the leader. But he brushed it aside. If only everyone would do the same, there would be no need of me. Years later, it is written that the same tribe noticed that all the tribes around them had developed a new political innovation, one that would lift the tribe out of its parochial short-sightedness into a potentially grand civilization. The innovation was a new office held by a human with what was again believed to be a divinely bestowed right: kingship, a king and a kingdom. Leviathan, a strong, benevolent, and just ruler to keep the myriad of mongrels from bloodletting in the streets with their common indecency and petty squabbles. This civilized tribe was told, however, that they did not need this political innovation, that this political innovation was no innovation at all, that if they would only police themselves, they would not have to cede freedom and authority to another person that by all accounts was just like them. The people refused. Everyone else had this new toy, and they wanted it too. But envy always begets blood and fire, and the warnings proved true. For every all-powerful ruler that led the people with justice, truth, and mercy, there would be 10 who would reset the clock of progress with a capricious cycle of decadence, subsidized by the rabble, and a disproportionate shock and awe response of mimetic wrath in which the rabble was caught in the crossfire. Years later, in another story, a master of whispers told a riddle. A king, a rich man, and a priest were at odds as to who deserved ultimate authority. They each in turn tried to convince a mercenary in their midst to join their side and kill the other two. Join me, the king beckoned, and you will have lands and titles. Join me, the rich man offered, and you can buy all the lands and titles you want, and there's more where that came from. Join me, the priest prayed, and you will have the favor of God. What are lands and titles? They will only pass away. I offer you eternity. Who dies and who wins? That is the question that George R.R. Martin poses in Game of Thrones through the mouth of the Master of Whispers, the spider, Varys. And this is the central thought experiment explored in both the books and the shows. Martin followed in the fantasy tradition of J.R.R. Tolkien, but with a crucial difference. Instead of using fantasy to depict the cosmic struggle between good and evil, Martin wanted to use fantasy as a lens to view the political machinations of people in the real world who refused to give up the concept of kingship. Martin took the romantic notions of eagles, elves, and the childlike wonder of hobbits in the Shire and plunged them into the mud, blood, and the Dornish red of a fantasy world recreation of power struggles of Old England. The War of the Roses in England from approximately 1455 to 1485 served as the real source material for Martin's fantasy, not so much Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Subversion of romantic fantasy with real-world debauchery, draconian overreaction, and peer-reviewed power struggles penned in blood were the name of this game, the Game of Thrones. Today I want to talk about Game of Thrones, the books, the shows, and the point of it all. Who deserves to win? What is Martin saying? Is this the worst adaptation of a book series in history? Is this the worst TV show of all time, as some YouTubers assert? Is there anything in the rubble of King's Landing worth fighting for? These are the questions for today's The Surfing Violinist podcast, broadcasting live from my bedroom in Panama City Beach, Florida. And I'm joined by Judah McNeil, broadcasting from an undisclosed location somewhere in Chicago. How you doing?
We'll call it Jason's office.
Jason's office. It sounds very noble, very prestigious.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Can I point of clarification?
Sure.
I get lost sometimes in your alliteration. That there.
Go ahead.
What did that mean?
Which part?
The rabble part. So can you unpack that a little bit?
Okay.
The poeticness of it was beautiful, but I got raptured in the beauty.
Okay. Let's see. I think it's that part about
the people refuse. That part.
But envy always begets blood and fire, and the warnings proved true. For every all-powerful ruler that led the people with justice, truth, and mercy, there would be 10 who would reset the clock of progress with a capricious cycle of decadence subsidized by the rabble and a disproportionate shock and awe response of mimetic wrath in which the rabble was caught in the crossfire. So the idea being, for those who aren't clear, I'm referencing the Jewish story of how they came to have kings. And it was something that, according to the Jewish story, God did not want them to have kings. And they saw kings around them, and they were like, oh, we want a king too. We got to have a king. And so the rest of that, their whole story ends up this weird just cycle. It's almost like the Greek myths in a way. It's like sometimes the gods are kind and sometimes the gods are cruel. 90% of the time the gods are cruel, and the gods in this case were the kings. And you'd have one king that had this bountiful, and you'll find this all over the world. I mean, it's in Hinduism, Ram, like he's a good king. You find that, like David, he was in the Jewish traditions a goodish king. I mean, not 100%, like he made some mistakes. But then you would have some crazy person, some psychopath that just would live such a decadent life. Like you think of Nero in Rome as an emperor. Just this decadent life, and basically using all of their vassal states and all of their slaves and all of their servants and political machinery just to subsidize their wanton life of pleasure. And And then, but what happens is that ends up creating this unrest. And so in Game of Thrones, it's depicted by the people who end up raising up the Sparrow. The Sparrow ends up coming up and, as a priest, ends up overthrowing the power structures because the people are tired of being, crapped on by the people who are the leaders. So the rabble rises up. But, Zerani, thank you. Subscribing. Oh, whoa. Appreciate it. Evening from Chennai. You're still in Chennai. Woo. Sweet. Zerani sent me some pictures from India this week. It was, got a little teary-eyed. It was good. Anyways, thank you, Zerani, for the subscription. So, the Sparrow, he overthrows the existing power structure. At that point, it was Cersei, and you could almost see that as the Sparrow is kind of like a pope, speaking for the downtrodden people and kind of inserting themselves into the Game of Thrones, saying that they're going to bring God into the equation and then get all these petty human, squabbles out. But the problem is you get dirty in the process, and what ends up happening? All those people that you were, using on their behalf, on their benefit, they end up getting caught in the crossfire later by unexpected things like Daenerys coming in and just obliterating everyone, or Cersei blowing up the Sept and all the collateral damage. I mean, think about how many innocent people died when Cersei had her Light of the Seven moment. That kind of stuff. When people say like, "Oh man, these character arcs are just too." These character arcs are just too all over the place. It's not a character arc. It's like a seismograph. It's like, yeah, look at history. Okay, look at the 20th century. Tell me the 20th century isn't a seismograph. I mean, incredibly insane stuff happens all the time. People break. People have character breaks every day, and the rabble gets caught in the middle. It's the little person that gets caught in the middle. You can use them as political capital one minute, and then the next minute you're just killing them. You're just using them as fodder. So that's kind of what that sentence means.
Okay. So I don't know where you're going with this. So I kind of wonder, where do you see yourself in this struggle?
Where do I see myself in this struggle?
Yeah. So I guess we're applying it to real life,
right?
Or are we just talking about Game of Thrones?
No. Yeah, I think that's really the point, is to talk about real life, because my whole hypothesis, and so I was telling some of the viewers who were here before you got in that my whole hypothesis or sort of purpose here is to what the heck is happening?
What happened?
I've lost my cursor.
Oh.
What the world?
Curses.
That was so weird. I was curious. Okay, sorry. The question was, where do we fit in this? Okay, so my hypothesis is today's episode. And we're going to see in like a year, after I've watched the entire series again and I've finished reading. It'll probably take me a year to finish The Dance with Dragons. I get so bored, man. I just get so bored.
I didn't even bother reading it.
All due respect to Martin, we'll talk about a lot of this later on, but all due respect to Martin, I just get bored. I get bored with fiction when I read it in book form. That's why I read Philip K. Dick short stories. I can handle that because it's short enough, but I am like ADD when it comes to reading literary fiction, really bad about it. So, I get lost. But yeah, I want to come back after about a year and kind of check and see if my hypothesis is correct. And my hypothesis being that Game of Thrones is really talking about, as long as you play political power struggle games, as long as you believe in a throne, people are going to get caught in the crossfire. Like that. That's kind of what my working hypothesis is. Yeah. And as far as where I would fit in the Game of Thrones, one thing I'd like to do, I'd almost like to start a segment called This Day in History and talk about a day which everyone would know as a terrible thing happening, like the day that Columbine happened, the day that the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. You want to talk about Daenerys losing her shit and just killing all these innocent people? That was America at the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. Just absolutely out of nowhere, these people snapped and killed children. There were no soldiers in this village. It's one of the most disgusting, brutal things you will ever hear, and it happened in the last century. So when this this stuff does not, it comes out of left field seemingly. You look at Columbine, it comes out of left field seemingly, but it wasn't left field for those people. There was something going on stewing in their soul and in their heart and their mind, and they snapped. And this stuff keeps happening. I mean, not just at the individual level, but at the corporate level and at the governmental level. And so this idea, this day in history, you would take some terrible thing like that, and then you would talk about something on the other side of the planet in which, as Jeff Goldblum says, a butterfly flaps its wings in Peking, and in Central Park you get rain instead of sunshine. It's chaos theory, but in a good way. Someone invented someone. Someone did a line of code that changed the internet forever. The Brothers Chaps started Homestar Runner. Like, it's just things that seem very small and unnecessary or trivial, but end up changing the world forever. So you may not, there might be communists in the group here. I am not a communist. I'm not a Marxist. When Jordan B. Peterson, and I'm not, for anyone who's not a fan of JBP, like, no big deal, but I think this is a really interesting thing that he said. I think it was a Rogan podcast. He was either Rogan or Jocko. I think it was Rogan. And JBP said what really took down communism in Russia was not ideology. It wasn't the Cold War. He's like, if it was the car, it was the personal automobile. Mm-hmm. And you think about that, like the automobile, the automobile, the printing press, the Wright brothers, like these tiny little inventions that have changed everything forever, like an invention. So this day in history, instead of this day in history, instead of the, following the if it bleeds it leads cycle of capricious, Greco-Roman tragedy, let's talk about the insanely good things that are happening. Insanely, it's monumental, man. Some of this technology. I mean, obviously, every new technological world begets a whole new spectrum of things that can go wrong and people misuse. I get all that. But we're talking to each other live. We got a few people hanging out with us from America to India and beyond and back again. That's cool, man.
That's amazing. Yeah.
And we're talking about stuff like it's Saturday morning.
Well, it's the realistic manifestation of magic. It really is magic.
Yes.
It's man making things happen with beyond like sticks and rocks.
Yeah, like this is the what the witch doctors dreamed of. And that first story I told was about the Jewish story about Moses. Moses is supposed to be the representative of God, and they tell him that these people are speaking for God out at their tents. And like this whole notion we have of holy places and stuff like that, and the sovereignty of kings and the specialty of certain people. Like even Moses, who was supposed to be, I mean, think about this. Think about a pastor or a priest or an imam today having that attitude. I'm sorry, I just messed up my. Hold your ears. It's still there. I lost it. Hold on.
Hello?
Hold on. Check. Can you hear me?
Hello?
Check.
You're like in a can. I don't know. Oh, whoa.
Am I still out?
I think you're still a little shortage.
Tell them to mute there. Tell them to mute.
Everyone, mute your ears because mute. Hello? Mute.
Check.
Okay, you're back.
Sorry about that, guys. So what happened was I was in India. Me and Noble Luke, some viewers of the channel remember Noble Luke. I think we're trying to record something, and I had this Shure X2U connector that allows you to, hook up a mic into a USB. And I had it on a mic stand, and the mic stand fell over. And that was 3 years ago, and it's been broken ever since. And so if it doesn't sit just perfectly right, it's going to do that. So sorry for your ears.
How ironic, though, just as we're talking about the magic of technology, it
No, that's again, no, that's a commentary on me. That's not a commentary on the match. That's a commentary on my disorganization. However, this week, check it out.
What do you got?
It's a lot better. Look at my room. There's no clothes on the floor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good job.
Clean up my mess a little bit. So anyways, speaking of cleaning up messes, so JBP, his point was that really the best apologist, the best evangelist for individualism or capitalism or freedom, any however you want to say that, was the automobile. And then once people experience that freedom themselves, they're like, I need to, okay, I'll use public transportation on this day, but I need to go to the park on this day. I want to take my kids to the park on this day. And the public transportation doesn't go at the time I can. So, that all this stuff it's just, it's almost like an algorithm. Like, it's just the invention is designed in such a way that you don't have to have it interpreted for you. You can just do it. And so as far as where I see myself in the process is, I'd almost like to see a book written about Game of Thrones in which there were people, like the inventions that people were making that weren't war-based. Like someone comes up with the printing press and it undoes everything. The whole Citadel's control over things with ravens falls because they have a printing press now. Or they come up with some other thing.
Well, so the opposite of the extreme of technology breaks the control that the royalty has over us. But I heard a recent podcast by Scott Adams who's talking about how now it's going to swing to the other side where technology is going to control us, where it's going to tell us, oh, you're hungry right now. And we're going to be like, yeah, right. And then you're going to eat something, but oh, I guess I was hungry. And it's going to lead to us just being slaves to technology.
Yeah. So that's the next big battle. I mean, the next battle line really is the human against our creations. I wrote a short story about that when I was in India. It's called The Rite of Passage. And it's about an old man who goes to Walmart trying to get some Ben and Jerry's ice cream. And, basically it's all just nutty. I mean, everyone's become trans species, and trans species augmented humanity. Like, people are no longer people. They're like, Wolverines or something like that. And they don't, and really Google Suggest has become so all powerful that it actually tells you what you want. And so you don't have, and because you're told what you want, like, you have no reason. It's the old Tao Te Ching saying, empty their minds, fill their bellies, weaken their wills, strengthen their bones. It's the whole Brave New World idea that you just get what you want. So why would you ever revolt? That's,
right.
And so if technology just basically iRobot scenario, the robot, it becomes your master. WALL-E, another good example. Why get up and walk around? You can just ride everywhere, Right. WALL-E, I thought that's a pretty great depiction of our future if we're not careful. And then there's the other more sinister side where technology realizes, and a lot of these, including iRobot, I mean, most modern science fiction explores this, where the artificial intelligence turns on us because it realizes that we're not good. To me, that's more of that's the system of checks and balances on us.
Yeah.
Like, we either need to get better than our machines, or they probably are going to eat us alive. It's, the old Matrix thing.
How do we do that? I mean, how do you envision us getting better than our machines? What do you mean by that?
Well, I think part of it has to do with, I think people come to Game of Thrones, for instance, for certain reasons, and I think a lot of people's distaste with the show is I think Game of Thrones is kind of like a mirror. I think that that's what Martin meant it to be. I said in here, it's like he didn't mean to write another Lord of the Rings fantasy, commenting on these broader questions of good and evil, but a much more personal, individual, like, who's actually good and bad by the end if you're really paying attention. And if you think that certain uses of power or dependence on dragons is good or okay, then it really says more about what you think about humanity. That you're a pessimist. That, human beings have to have dragon fire. to motivate us, or we're always going to turn into, a rabble or something like that. That's a pretty pessimistic, old school. It's conservative, actually. That's a very conservative way of looking at the world. It's like people need rules, or we're going to turn into bad people. And not just rules, but when they need watchmen. We need arbitration, but from other people who are just like us.
Right. Democratized arbitration.
Right. Well, and I think that's what we're going to get with Game of Thrones. I think we're going to end up with a parliament, a democratized arbitration, and
which how does that work when you have somebody who can see the future, though?
Well, I think Bran will probably play a part in that, and he might extinguish himself or something. I don't know. See, what I think the show is going to say, because it is a Song of Ice and Fire, is as long as human beings are willing to use magic that is asymmetrically destructive. So the magic of the Lord of Light, for instance, if you have a Lord of Light that you believe is ultimate, there will be an equal and opposite ice. There will be a Night King, and he will respawn. I mean, Arya could kill him a bajillion times. As long as there is a Lord of Light, there is going to be a Night King.
Well, that's like the Star Wars. There's always where there's a Sith Lord, where there's a
right.
There's always that counterbalance.
So interestingly, I mentioned this book, I think I might have even been last week. There was a fan, it was one of those fan fiction kind of books, but it was one of the biggest ones. It's called The Truce at Bakura. And in that, a lot of the characters hated the Force. There was this one character, like there was a whole movement of people that thought the Force was a bad thing because it basically there's only so much energy in the universe. And so someone who has the Force is basically taking it away from normal people. That's a pretty interesting little idea there.
That is interesting.
And
that sounds a little too socialist for me.
Well, no, I don't think that that's necessarily the point. I think it's more getting at this whole idea that if someone meddles with the fabric of space-time through a magical means, not a technological means, but a magical means. Like there's some sort of hidden knowledge to get there, not an open knowledge. I think it all comes down to the Ring of Gyges that Plato talks about, which is the Lord of the Rings. This ring that makes you invisible. If you have something that makes you invisible to everybody else, it's a backroom deal. If your power structure revolves around something only you have access to, and it's closed, then that creates the need for an equal and opposite reaction. So that's kind of the point there. It's like if you have a light side Jedi, well, you're going to have a dark side Jedi. And in the meantime, they're both sapping energy from the middle. I think that actually is a pretty helpful. Yeah. I think that's a pretty helpful view of the world, because that's what religions have done. That's what superstitions have done. That's what political power structures have done. They've said, I don't believe that everyone's born with the same traits. I don't believe that everyone's equally good at everything. That's just stupid. Like I can't sew. I can't cook. Like I eat a Pop-Tart. That's me cooking, like this. So we're not all equally good at everything. It's just insipid. However, this whole idea that only certain people are capable of making good decisions. Yeah, that's pretty nihilistic, because that will always keep this cycle. That keeps the wheel that Daenerys talks about earlier on. I'm going to break the wheel. Yeah, right. I mean, you're another part of the wheel. The Targaryens are the wheel for all intents and purposes. As long as you think that there needs to be somebody turning the wheel, and that there's only a special class of people, and generally, and when that becomes a thing, it usually means that it becomes professional, or it becomes like Varus's parable. It becomes divine right or money. It's basically you buy it, you are bequeathed it because of your family line, or God gives it to you. And you don't have much control over any of those things. The reason why capitalism has won in the modern day and age, at least with money, there can be some exterior way of determining who is the meritocracy, right? Like whoever has the most money makes the decisions. Well, it's as terrible as that seems to us today, it is definitely a step in the right direction from the
Whoever has the most violence.
Whoever has the most violence, whoever has the best blood, we'll talk about racism, whoever has the best blood, or whoever has the divine right. And the thing is, the divine right, all three of those can be faked. All three of those can be faked. Well, I mean, the violence one can't necessarily be faked, but the other two can be faked fully. I mean, that's what all Game of Thrones is. They're all arguing over who has the proper blood. It's like, is it Baratheon blood? Is it Lannister blood? Is it Targaryen blood? But as far as the God one, I mean, that is the easiest one to lie about.
Yeah.
By far. And I think that's why it's interesting. That's why I referenced that Jewish story, because way before kings were even a thing in the Jewish culture, here was this guy deferring. He was open sourcing God. Like that's risky, right? Because maybe somebody says, well, God told me to kill you. Well, what are we going to do then? Yeah. But the fact that he had that much faith in humanity all the way back then, we don't have enough faith in humanity to like open source hardly anything, anymore. Yeah. I mean, thankfully, with the internet and with computers, there are a lot of people who have. And so Godspeed to those people.
So, I mean, what you're getting at is it's a much more of a like anarchist view of our solution.
Yeah, maybe I'm an anarchist. Open source. Oh shoot! Sorry, I've got my audio. My audio came back in. Yeah, maybe a little bit. I mean, I'm an optimist, but at the same time, I'm not like so idealistic that I think that everything's just that this is gonna be an easy fight translating autonomy from a privileged few to everyone. Like it's a very, very long, complicated process. But I think the reason why we have Game of Thrones is it is a step in that direction, though, because if you look at even Lord of the Rings, which is talking about the cosmic struggle between good and evil, and there's more nuance in Lord of the Rings than I think some critics would like to admit. But at the same time, Aragorn's king at the end. He's king. So I don't think Tolkien had a profound distrust of democracy. Tolkien, Lewis. Interestingly, the one person that people don't talk about when they talk about fantasy, I mean, Martin will talk a lot about Tolkien in terms of, he's kind of the father of modern fantasy. But George MacDonald is a really curious innovation. Without him, we don't get much Tolkien or Lewis. And MacDonald, again, he's kind of going in a different direction where I don't know. It's interesting. I think he kind of gets into that.
Was it George MacDonald, right?
Princess and the Goblin, The Princess and Curdie, The Wise Woman. They're a bunch of small children's stories, and they're less epic in scope than something like Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones. Much more focused and very childlike. His writing style is not the greatest thing ever. He can definitely be overtly poetic. He was definitely influenced by the Romantic poets from I think of the German tradition and stuff like that. So if you think of like Beethoven's Ode to Joy, like the poem that's used in that, like that guy Schiller, I think was a big. I'm kind of a lot of what we're talking about. If you go back and read the libretto, like the actual lyrics to the original Ode to Joy, if you read it translated from the German, it's a lot of what I'm saying. It's this kind of idealistic, like we're the brotherhood of humanity. Okay, so maybe not everyone is equal in merit in terms of specific roles, but everyone is equal in terms of dignity and the spark of God. Like every human being still has the spark of God. Every human being, like the term that he uses at the end of Beethoven's Ninth, when it all goes to really, really rapturous sort of epicness. He say over and over Götterfunken, which means God spark. Like that's what he's saying, that we're all God sparks. So anyways, I think what you get in terms of moving from Lord of the Rings to Game of Thrones, you get this much more distrust of the powers that be. and
Well, you get a more human vision, like a more fleshy vision of the human nature.
Right.
I mean, just it reminds us like how little we can, how little we appreciate, or how little we see that God spark in other people
Yes.
when it comes down to our own selfishness.
Right. And again, you see this all over the world. Like, traditionally, the namaste in India, there's a recognition of the dignity or the God inspired part of the other human. But even when we say these things so often, or it becomes tradition, it seems to just be lost. Like, there's some part of us as humans that we just kind of succumb to the Game of Thrones at every point of society. It's like, employees and bosses like are supposed to be on the same team, but they both work at cross purposes. Different departments in a corporation work at cross purposes. Like, they're playing the Game of Thrones. And it's better to have the Game of Thrones. Again, it's better to have money as a mediating factor in a Game of Thrones than blood and fire and sword. It's just, that's a fact. After that, and Slavoj Žižek and Jordan B. Peterson had their debate on capitalism and Marxism, and Žižek even said, like, point blank, he said, look, like, I agree that capitalism is the only game in town. Like, he said, it's the only game in town. I don't like it, though. I mean, that's basically his thing. And I think even if we are capitalists, I think we can sympathize that there's something still broken about our systems. And I would say that it's the Game of Thrones still persists in a money-based system.
Absolutely. I to me, I mean, as somebody of faith, I don't put my complete trust in any system, any natural system or man-made system, for sure. In fact, like, I think the thing that the reason I'm drawn to capitalism is because it's so dependent on natural forces, and I don't think any capitalist would say like this, that capitalism is God. Capitalism is what is the end all be all. I think it's a tool. Right. Nobody takes a hammer and says, man, this thing, it's, I need to worship it. You know what I mean? It's a tool.
Kind of. I mean, if the Austrian way of discussing, I mean, I pretty much am an Austrian economist at heart, I guess.
Mises?
Mises, yeah, and Rothbard and all those guys, Hayek. But they do talk about the invisible hand a lot. And if you were an alien coming to Earth and you heard a free market capitalist talking about the invisible hand, you would think, oh, this is their God. So, and when they say the invisible hand, it is basically a God of the gaps, their inability to describe the inner workings of human action at the building, trading, making, working, serving level. It's kind of an umbrella term that if humans would get out of the equation, if there weren't a Game of Thrones and more of a game of service, a game of meritocracy based on how good you are actually doing without cheating, because that's what the Game of Thrones is. It's a game of cheats. Daenerys is cheating. She has 3 dragons. Like, that's not a fair, there is no balance of power.
It's interesting though, because if it gets, the more fair it gets, the less control we'll have. So Scott Adams was talking about this in that same podcast about how if as technology increases.
Yeah. But, no, that's good. I like that. That's good.
As like technology increases, and it can better define who we are. Like he's about this strength. He has this amount of education, this IQ. At some point we don't have to have a job interview. They already know. Like,
yeah, and the podcast that Jared recommended a couple of weeks ago, the William Von Hippel podcast with Joe Rogan. In that podcast, it is pretty interesting because he talks about how things that would seem to be deficiencies for human beings, setbacks, that's what actually set, from an evolutionary perspective. Of course, he's coming at it from that perspective, but that's what actually set human beings ahead, was because they weren't as strong as lions. So they had to rely on throwing. So they started, and he said, there's certain apes that you look at, they're actually incredible throwers. So like in The Hobbit, that's what they do. They throw rocks. And people are like, oh, the rocks, what's that going to do? Oh, no, it actually kills people. Yeah, it kills orcs. That's correct. Throwing rocks kills. That's why they used to stone people. No, throwing rocks is for real. So that's what these, instead of fighting hand to hand, the invention of the projectile is what made humans possible. It made human dominance possible. And what is that? That's using our brains. It's not using our brawn. And so
it's like overcorrection or compensation in one area.
Exactly. And so what is so amazing, what makes us human, is the fact that we can adapt our minds to solve problems and become good because of our adversity. That's it. Like other species are really tailor-made to the adversities, whereas we reconstitute ourselves to deal with the adversities. So you could think of so Francis Ngannou, he's one of the heavyweight UFC fighters. And this dude, he's from Africa. He worked in sand mines. I mean, one of the worst things you can possibly imagine in the 20th and 21st centuries to grow up doing, a modern slave. And the dude is a superstar now because his you don't get that buff by pumping iron. Lifting sand, you think about how you would have to lift those sandbags and stuff like that. You're working your whole body. It's like farmer strength. And that's why some of these, country bumpkin, like Texas farm football teams are so good. They have this range. Again, it seems like an adversity, and it is. And you don't want to ever say, oh, well, we should, have more people work in sand mines. I'm not saying that. But maybe if you want to get in good shape, maybe you should. Maybe you should just volunteer. Quit going to the gym and go to the sand mine. Work alongside somebody. See how an oppressed person actually feels. And it'll probably be a better workout while you're at it. I mean, that may be the future right there. Instead of, poverty porn tourism, you actually go and work with these people and get there and hear what's going on. Don't just talk about it from Washington. Go down there. And in the meantime, you'll probably start to realize, oh, wow. I mean, this is hell. Don't make light of it. It's hell living in this place. But at the same time, these people laugh. They have friends. They have family. They're human beings. They're not just mongrels. And you start to realize that the plight of the working man is not some sort of theoretical concept. And human beings develop strengths from that. I mean, some of the industriousness I've seen in India with some dude who starts off some little side business, making chicken, on the side of the road. And then he just becomes a master at it. And you try to duplicate, you can't do it. You go and eat that shit. You're like, dude. I mean, you should just go. It's almost like, every now and then, like I played a gig last night. We didn't even have a tip jar out, and because it was a public event, and people at the end just came up and started putting money under the speaker. And sometimes you just feel compelled, when you're in I think probably, if you're traveling through India. Next time you get one of those guys, you should just give them some mammoth tip. This is the best chicken I've ever had. I mean, because it's more of a free will. This is incredible. That's what humans are capable of, though, right? Humans are capable of this improvisation and creativity in the worst of circumstances.
Well, and it goes back to a theme that me and you often come back to is the importance of adversity.
Yeah.
And that crucible, and I think that's something that will be hard. I don't for an AI to understand.
Right.
I don't, but it might be able. What if it is able to find the ingredients? This person, you need this much adversity today. I don't think it can, because
weird stuff is going to happen. I mean, the singularity. Yes, it is on the way. Well, let's get back to Game of Thrones a little bit.
Sorry.
So a couple things. Worst TV show of all time. I'm just going to go ahead and get that one out of the way. Hard no. Hard no on that one. Can you name off 5 worst TV shows off the top of your head? I mean, I'm pretty sure I could. But no.
It's no, hard no.
Okay.
Yeah. Would it be well, okay, but that's an easy answer. Where is it though at the top?
Okay, let's get there. Worst adaptation of all time. A hard no for me too. Hard no. Have you ever seen any video game movie adaptation? Every single one.
Yeah.
Hard no for me.
Yeah.
Okay. Some of the criticisms, especially, I was totally on board with the criticisms of episode 3 and 4. Like I was so frustrated. I was like, we're in lost territory at this point. I am never going to talk about this show again. Like 3 and 4 they just sunk my world. It was awful. But then episode 5 came out, and I'm almost willing to forgive all the bad writing the last 2 seasons because of this episode, because it's Game of Thrones. For me, this episode was Game of Thrones, episode 5. So in terms of people complaining about character arcs and character development and plot structure and blah 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 blah, applying traditional literary arguments regarding character development, foreshadowing, dramatic and situational irony to Game of Thrones makes about as much sense as applying rules of penmanship used by calligraphers to blogs. New wine, new wineskin. Imagine blaming the sick, twisted, and confusing logic of the Game of Thrones on writing and plot structure, because this isn't a story. Okay, this is not Aristotelian. Aristotle was not God. He gave a format for Greco-Roman drama and comedy. Okay, we're 2,000 years later. You think maybe our ways of telling stories might have changed a little bit? If you want classic plot structure, if you want the best form of Greek drama, Greek tragedy, you get it in The Godfather, almost perfection, probably perfection, and the best show maybe in that tradition, Breaking Bad. You get this slow, long, methodical slide into from, Michael Corleone to The Godfather over 5 seasons with Walt's arc from Walt to Heisenberg. This slow, that is Aristotelian plot structure at its best. It's perfect character development. It's just wonderful. Game of Thrones isn't that. That's not what it is. Game of Thrones is a fantasy adaptation that is designed to be subversive, not in the Rian Johnson Last Jedi tradition, but designed from the beginning to be subversive of Aristotelian plot structure, because it's taking a look at 15th century English history and putting fantasy around it. So there is a podcast called the History of England podcast with David Crowther, and he's got I don't know how many. I've only gotten 2 or 3 in. He's got all these podcasts about the War of the Roses. And this is a quote here. So I want you to think of this in terms of Daenerys. Maybe one of the... I'll see if I can do it in my received pronunciation here. Maybe one of the tragedies of the civil wars was there are plenty of people acting to try to avoid conflict, but no one quite managed to rise above it. That's David Crowther, History of England podcast, episode 165, Bloodshed. It's about 16 minutes in. These people were trying to play the Game of Thrones, but the problem is, just like Cersei says, when you play the Game of Thrones, you either win or die. If you go back and look at Dany's arc, one of the most pivotal moments, really, is Olenna Tyrell telling her, when everyone else, they just told Dany to change her mind because she wanted to attack King's Landing. And she's like, let's just go in and all guns blazing. And they're like, no, we shouldn't do that. We need to save the people. So everyone leaves the room. And she's like, okay. So she decides to, take Tyrion's advice. And Olenna says to her, I've been listening to men all my life, and they're always blah, 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 bunch of idiots. Be the dragon. That's stuck in her head. Because after that, she kills the Tarleys. I'm sorry, there are spoilers here. Spoilers. I'm sorry, I'm giving spoilers. So be prepared. And as far as we'll get to some of that. But I just want to point out that the real source material here is War of the Roses. There's a fantastic little blog. It was written in 2016. I think I might have mentioned this last week. It's on a website called The Take, presented by Screen Prism. It was written back in June 12th of 2016, and the question was, how did the War of the Roses inspire Game of Thrones? They actually predict things that would happen in the next season. And if it's about... The War of the Roses was primarily The main combatants, belligerents, were the Yorks and the Lancasters, aka Starks and Lannisters. There's Richard of York, who's pretty close to being Ned Stark, and then you've got another one's Catherine. What was her name? Margaret of Anjou. So she would have been very much like Cersei, and this Margaret of Anjou, extremely smart tactician. So there's a lot of this stuff that, again, seems like it comes out of left field. Well, it came out of the history books. It's not coming out of Aristotle's, decree of how fiction should flow. Because Game of Thrones, my contention is it's not even fiction. It's just a reflection of human nature, political power struggles since the 15th century. Which, if you go before the 15th century, a lot of people will go back and read like the Bible or sacred writings or histories from like any time before 400 AD, and they'll be like, "Oh man, these people are so primitive." It's like, have you paid attention to history the last 100 years? Like, yeah, they were primitive. That was 2,000 years ago, and you expect them to have the insight that you do? History is very important. If you don't know the mistakes of the past, you'll be doomed to repeat them. Any thoughts on some of that?
So, I mean, basically what you're saying is you appreciated Dany's turn.
I did with some caveats.
Okay. And I can pretty much agree, but that wasn't the big problem I had with the episode. My problem is with the other characters, with Tyrion and with Cersei's and even Jaime.
Okay.
John, I just sure Dany's moment was authentic. I could definitely see building up to it. A lot of people, and it was too fast. But it's like the rest of them just kind of I don't know.
Okay,
just kind of looking on.
So a couple things. So George Lucas, when he got all the backlash for episodes 1 through 3, he got interviewed about like. Why is it like this? And he's like, if I want to paint a house and you want me to paint it green, but I paint it white, well, that's my prerogative. It's my house. And that always just struck me as so irresponsible, right? Like, no, man, no, I know it's your story, but we're not talking about you painting a white house. We're talking about you painting one white strip on a wall and the rest is primer. It's not that you painted it white, it's that you painted it white and you didn't execute it well. Like, just because you're the creator doesn't exonerate you. And so I do understand people's frustration over this stuff. However, if his point was to, it's like going up to a Picasso and saying, "How dare you, Picasso? Why would you paint it like this? Haven't you seen Rembrandt? Michelangelo?" Like, that's not Picasso's point. He's trying to do something different. So I think a lot of people come in with certain expectations. Like, I come in to Martin's writing with certain expectations. I like brevity, baby. Like Shakespeare, brevity is the soul of wit. Let's get the point, man. But that's not his purpose. So there's a great tweet storm, and so I'm going to read this whole thing. It's by this guy named Daniel Silverman, and he explains from a writing perspective, and this is fantastic. This is one of the best examples of what's gone wrong between the show and the books. First of all, just remember, the purpose of cinema is to show, don't tell. The greatest sin you can commit in cinema is exposition. The problem we've had with the last 2 years is we haven't had enough. So we're finally seeing a show that just took the exposition thing and like, you know what, we're just not going to explain anything. We're just going to show it. We got a lot of our ground to cover. Let's just go. Show, don't tell, baby. Action. Cut to the chase. So they do that for 2 seasons, and you start to realize why you do need some. Why you do need your characters to hang a lantern on certain audience expectations. You need to service the fans a little bit more, or you're in this territory. I mean, we're in full Cliff Notes mode in these last 2 seasons. So Daniel Silverman says, "Want to know why Game of Thrones feels so different now? I think I can explain without spoilers. It has to do with the behind-the-scenes process of plotters versus pantsers. If you're not familiar with the distinction, plotters create a fairly detailed outline before they commit a single word to the page. Pantsers discover the story as they write it, often treating the first draft like one big, elaborate outline. Neither approach is right, just a way to characterize the writing process. But the 2 approaches do tend to have different advantages. So if you think about there's certain people, I'm pretty sure the Coens refuse to plot anything. They refuse to outline and know where they're going. Because if they can get their characters into a corner that they don't know how to get out of, when they get the characters out, it feels earned. Okay, so
Real,
that's like a different real. But other people outline, and both approaches have their own benefits, as this guy's going to explain. Because they have the whole story in mind, the pantser, it's usually easier for, because they have the whole story in mind, the plotter, it's usually easier for plotters to deliver tighter stories and stick the landing when it comes to endings, but their characters can sometimes feel stiff, like they're just plot devices. Pantsers have an easier time writing realistic characters because they generate the plot by asking themselves what this fully realized person would do or think next in the dramatic situation the writers drop them in. But because pantsers are making it up as they go along, hence the name, they're flying by the seat of their pants, they're prone to meandering plots and can struggle to bring everything together in a satisfying conclusion. Sound familiar? That's why a lot of writers plot their stories but pants their characters and use the second draft to reconcile conflicts between the two. What does this have to do with Game of Thrones? Well, George R.R. Martin is one of the most epic pantsers around. He talks about writing like cultivating a garden. He plants a character seeds and carefully lets them grow and grow. That's why every plot point and every fair in hindsight surprise landed with such devastating weight. That the surprise that's earned, like we talked before.
Yeah.
Everything that
inevitable.
happened,
what was it?
Inevitable surprise. Surprising but inevitable. Everything that happened to these characters happened because of their past choices. But it's also the reason why the narrative momentum of the book slowed over time. After the first big plot arc, Book 4 was originally going to skip ahead 5 years, but George R.R. Martin didn't know how to make the gap in action feel true to the characters or the world, so he eventually decided to just write his way through those 5 years instead. 5 years covered in A Feast for Crows. 5 years! And if you've read that, I skipped it. I just read the cliff notes of Feast for Crows. There's so many like side characters and stuff, but there is good stuff. There's a lot of diamonds in the rough in Feast for Crows, which meant planting more seeds in Feast for Crows and watching those grow. And suddenly his garden was overgrown and hard to prune without abrupt or forced resolutions. He had no choice but to follow each and every other one of these plot threads, even when they didn't really matter to the story. And now that the plants were fully in control, he struggled to get some of the characters that had grown one way to go where they needed to go for the story. Danny getting stuck in Marine is the example he frequently cites. And it does. And I want you to think about that. Danny's stuck in Marine for years. We're not talking about a couple episodes. You're stuck in Marine for years, chomping at the bit to get back to Westeros and claim her rightful throne. Pressure builds up, people. And because he had all this story to cover and pay off, some of which was growing in the wrong directions and needed enough narrative space to come back around, he started increasing the number of books he thought it would take him to complete the series. And well, so the books the showrunners were adapting ran out. What now? People assumed that the show suffered because they didn't have GRRM's rich material to draw on anymore, as if the problem was that he's simply better at generating new plots than they are. But that's not what happened. For a season or two, the showrunners actually tried to take over management of Martin's sprawling garden with understandably mixed results. When that didn't work, they shifted their focus to try to bring this huge beast in for a landing. They gave themselves a fixed endpoint, 13 episodes to the finale, and no more, and set about reverse engineering the rest of the story they wanted to tell. Think about that as a dilemma. Think about that as a goal. That's difficult to navigate, folks. They wanted to deliver an ultimately satisfying experience. So with only 2 seasons to work with, they started asking themselves what was left to do. What could they build with the pieces left in the box? What beats did they just have to include? What big moments did they want to deliver? Where should the characters end up? What did they think we, the audience, wanted to see on the screen before the show came to an end? It was a Game of Thrones bucket list. And once they had that list, it was time to connect the dots to make it all happen. So they started maneuvering the characters into the emotional and literal places they needed to be for all those dots to connect up in the right way. That's why Game of Thrones feels different now. A show that had been about the weight of the past became about the spectacle of the present. Characters with incredible depth and agency, all the more rope with which to hang themselves, became pieces on a giant war map. Where once the characters authored their own terrible destinies, now they were forced to take uncharacteristic actions and make uncharacteristically bad decisions so the necessary plot points could happen and the appropriate stakes could be felt. That's pretty accurate, I think. Organic developments gave way to contrivance. Naturally paced character arcs were rushed. Living plants became puppets of the plot. The characters just weren't in charge anymore. The ending was. No one's to blame. Keeping a million plates spinning the way GRRM did is hard, and setting those plates down without breaking too many, which the showrunners had to do, is also really hard. Creation in general is hard. Amen to that. There's a reason writers have haunted eyes and always seem like they need a hug and become alcoholics. Give everyone a break. But the shift in approach did have consequences. Is pantsing better than plotting? No. And this has nothing to do with which approach is right anyway. It's about the approach changing in the third act. That's the sort of thing an audience can feel happening, even if they can put the finger on exactly why. The audience fell in love with one kind of show, but the ending is being imported from a different kind of show. Now I happen to think the finale will stick the landing. It's what the showrunners have been building toward these past 2 seasons after all. But to be satisfying, it matters how we got there too. Treating the journey as equally important is how you get endings that feel earned, and it's how characters keep feeling real the whole way through, even though they're completing arcs some writer has chosen for them. By placing so much emphasis on the ending, the showrunners changed the nature of the story they were telling, meaning the original story and the original characters aren't the ones getting an ending, the substitutes are. That's why no amount of spectacle or fan service can make this ending as satisfying as it should be. Resolutions invite us to consider the story as a whole, where it all started, where it all ended up, and we can feel the discontinuity in this one. Well, that ended up being a long thread, so here's a picture of a very nice dog. So I think that's pretty great. Special thanks to Harsh. He says, with a £50 donation from Coventry, England. Hello, Ford. I hope you are well. Happened to see that you were on live stream, and I wanted to show my support. Thanks so much. If you would like to support this podcast, head on over to patreon.com/thesurfingviolinist, or you can do like Harsh just did and throw us a tip or a subscription on YouTube or Twitch. Thanks so much, Harsh. Your donation will help probably replace that mic debacle, so we don't have people's ears breaking in the future. Yes. So thank you so much. I've been living with that mic for attachment for 4 years or something, and I broke it in week 1, so I won't break it this time.
So in response to that thing, the what came to my mind, where I think you introduced me to Pixar's rules for writing. Have you seen that?
Oh, man, I don't remember. It's possible.
Okay. Well, what they talk about is each character needs to. So they have an excellent mix of pantsing and plotting, where they make it very important to write the ending first, but they make it part of their rules are to make sure that every character turn is earned. And they think through it, like, would he do this? Would I do this if I were in this?
Yeah, you think of good examples of pantsing and plotting. Pixar has definitely a great track record. I mean, they hit both very well. I mean, they don't always stick the landing, and they don't always stick the pantsing. You know, there's certain characters you really couldn't care less about. One of the things I wanted to mention was Joss Whedon. So when he was given Avengers, the first Avengers, one of my favorite action movies ever. Not just favorite superhero movies. One of my favorite action movies ever. It's just so Joss, but it's so Marvel. It's so like he just gets everything right. You got pantsing, you got plotting, and what he was given beats. So some people have surmised that GRRM gave the showrunners 3 episodes. Basically, this needs to happen. This needs to happen. This needs to happen. You know, what happened last episode had to happen, and they had to get there. And so they had to basically stitch it together, right? And so Joss was given the same thing. He's like, okay, Thor has to pick up, Thor has to use the hammer on Captain America's shield. The Hulk has to try to pick up the hammer. We have to have this fight between these two. And, you know, just little fan service things that needed to fit in, but not feel like fan servicey. You feel earned. Again, surprising, but inevitable. And so Joss's goal was basically just to be a tailor, you know, just to tie all this stuff together, and he did it with aplomb. I mean, it's just it's as good as you can do. Now, everyone keeps calling, you know, on the internet, they're calling them Dumb and Dumber, the Weiss and what's his name, D&D. I'm sorry, like they messed up for sure. I mean, the ways both. If you go back and watch the way the first dragon goes down above the wall, that whole sequence is just. Oh, I mean, you want to talk about cliff notes? It's almost like might as well be a music video. You know, just don't even have any dialogue and just show something happening, you know, for a while. It's bad. Like the way they tried to earn Danny's turn especially with the last dragon dying, was just, yeah. I mean, so I do understand. Like it's taken a lot out. But as far as sticking the landing, I felt like episode 5 did stick. So let's get to some of those questions you had. A lot of people. Okay, so Jeremy Johns, he said that Tyrion and Varys like switch places. Like Tyrion was always the smart one, and Varys was, you know, they should have like had Varys be on Dany's side. No, not at all. No, not full stop. No. From the beginning, Varys has been servant of the realm. You will go back and find that in season 1. There's a great scene that they preserve. This is Varys from the books, baby. Varys going and talking to Ed Stark before he's about to get executed, and Ned says, "Who do you serve?" "I serve the realm." That has been true of him the entire time. He is sick and tired of the little person getting shit on. Like, Varys is the real champion of the people. He really is. He's not a perfect man in the book. Oh, is it the books and the shows? I think they do have the thing where he finally catches the Red Priest that eunuchized him. So he actually has a reason to distrust all the religious elements, because he was a sacrifice for the Red God, for the Lord of Light. So he's distrustful of power, and he would never. No. So Jeremy, no, that's a full stop, full no. Varys would never serve Daenerys. He was willing to die for this one. Now, people forget what Tyrion went through. Again, A Feast for Crows lasted 5 freaking years. And in A Dance with Dragons, Tyrion is still out in the middle of nowhere, like, you know, being carted around trying to get to Dany. Like, he goes through so much shit. He, you know, sees Jorah, I think, turn into the, you know, a stone man. Like, he goes through so much bad stuff. If you go back and watch the moment when Tyrion sells his soul to Dany, it's really an emotional scene. This is the first time Tyrion has ever been emotional about a leader, about anybody other than a prostitute.
Yeah, you're right.
Like, he doesn't care about anybody on Earth except maybe Sansa. Like, Sansa's the only person that he actually has some shred of care for. When Dany, at that point, was making a lot of good leadership decisions, she set people free, he is like, oh man, this is the real deal. This is the authentic thing. He went all in on that moment. Why has Tyrion made stupid decisions since then? Because he's not the same Tyrion.
He's not angry.
He's not angry. He killed his dad, man.
Yeah.
Like that Rexapur. You've ever killed your dad? Like, come on. Tyrion is not the same person. He found a woman that he did not think of as a sex object, who he reverences as a queen. He has chivalrous, platonic, courtly love for Dany. Not like Jorah. Like, he's not trying to get in bed with Dany. He is not after her. He is there to serve her, and he believes in her. And that's people do. I mean, like, you know, people invest in a stock and they hold on to the bitter end. Like, I'm going to ride this out. I'm going to ride this out through the bear market, baby. He's holding on through the bear market, hoping. And as far as Jaime's arc, so I believe Tyrion's made some bad decisions, but that's the Game of Thrones, man. Like, Cersei's a skilled tactician. Like, she is, in some ways, I kind of like Cersei. Like, she's like the Walter White of the show to me, because if you go back and see how Robert Baratheon treats her, please. You don't have to be a feminist to side with Cersei against Robert. Robert was a douchebag idiot. I mean, just totally incompetent. Yeah. As far as Jaime, I loved the whole notion of Jaime being fully redeemed. I was rooting for that. I thought he was actually telling Brienne all that just so that she wouldn't follow him. I thought he was lying to her just so he wouldn't follow him. And then when I saw him reach King's Landing, I realized, no, he was coming back to die with Cersei. And, you know, as somebody, my dad's an ex-convict, and he's killed a man, okay? A lot of you haven't killed a man or know somebody who's killed a man that's close to you. If you were to push, I know this is a story, but it's a story rooted in reality. If you were to push a kid out of a window, you don't get redeemed out of that. I'm just telling you. You kill somebody, especially a defenseless kid, you do not get out of that. It might get out of you. You might be able to be partially redeemed, but just like Walt at the end of Breaking Bad, you don't get to have your family back. You know, my dad's been blessed that he's had a family and you know, we're on good terms. But like, he hasn't been able to enter public office. Like, he's relegated to his room. He lives a pretty hard life. Yeah. But he's not living in solitary confinement. Jaime doesn't get out of that, man. Like, him and Cersei are inextricably linked. They're twins that enabled each other to be terrible people. But they're not totally without some form of redemption. I know it seems like Cersei, there's no redeeming her. Dude, she ain't Daenerys, okay? Like, even Cersei wouldn't do what Dany just did. And that's why, like, Cersei just stands there. She cannot fathom this. When JBP talks about, like, why we need to be like Jung and go in and discover the shadow, it's because if you don't do it, if you don't see how evil you can be, if you don't imagine yourself as the worst type of person that you can imagine, there's somebody out there that will do it. They will go, if you don't believe you can in there, you won't prevent yourself from going there. Dany could never fathom a world in which someone would come and use Dragonfire to annihilate King's Landing, even though that in effect had already happened. In their lifetime, they'd seen the Mad King. They'd experienced this stuff. And they still couldn't fathom that somebody, a rational person, could think, because people aren't rational when family gets involved. And so that brings me to Dany. Dany's children are her dragons.
Yeah.
There's a reason Martin used dragons. This is a Lord of the Rings reference. In Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, specifically more of a Hobbit reference, Bilbo gets in with the dragon. And because of his time with the dragon, very little time, he gets dragon sickness. Once you want to talk about a glaring character arc change, an abrupt change, Thorin, the dwarf who's going back to get his gold, he gets the gold and immediately turns into a psychopath. And immediately starts a war with people. It's a lost cause war. Yeah. They won. It's over. Just split the loot, dude. And goes absolutely nuts. You want to talk about, man, Tolkien's pretty good in the plotting and scripting of that whole thing. Yeah. Like, Bilbo gets knocked out and wakes up and the war's over. Thorin went full-blown dragon sickness, Daenerys Targaryen, crazy. Yeah. And that's what happens when you have dragons. Dragons get in your soul. They get in your blood. And since they are her blood, since she treats them like family, the show takes such great pains. We've all been siding with the Starks this entire time, right? Well, the Starks, a lot of times, aren't better than the Lannisters. They do the same thing. The Starks, the Lannisters, the Martells, they make these decisions that destroy people's lives for the sake of their daughter, for the sake of their son. And so that's what happens when your kid's a dragon and you tell that kid to execute people, unlike Ned and Jon, who actually, cut off people's heads themselves. Dany has someone else do it for them. That gets into your psyche, man. Like, you're not a human being anymore. You are a sociopath if you're going to start doing that. Locking people up in a vault and letting them asphyxiate. That's an interesting way to punish a person, or you could just cut their head off, the most painless way. Yeah, so those are some of my thoughts on the character changes. As far as Jon in this last season, Jon has never been a genius. The Starks have never been known for their geniusness. That's true. I mean, Sansa and Arya are turning the tables here a bit, but Kat does stupid stuff in season 1. Yeah. She really, really tickles the lion. Like she makes it worse. Tywin was a great tactician. You don't go head to head with Tywin and Cersei. She didn't know what she was getting into. Ned didn't know what he was getting into.
Well, and I do appreciate that sort of. I appreciate that Jon embodies that. What's going on here? I'm just a warrior.
Right. Yes.
Lover, really. Yeah.
And he's a good man, and he's a good leader of soldiers. But like Eddard, he has more of that Stark in him than that Targaryen.
He really does. Yeah. Well, okay. So my response is that I agree with you, but on the other hand, I think so. I believe the writing, the story pans out. I agree with you that these things are true. They just were not given enough time to develop.
Right.
I think for those of us that are watching and it's just a little too jarring. I think it takes going in and hearing you talk about it to realize, yeah, you're right. But when you're watching it, it didn't. So D&D apparently have always wanted to only do they I think the Achilles heel was that they wanted to stick to 7 or 8. I think, you know, it eventually became 8 uh, uh, episodes. If they had just seasons, if they had just given it 3 more seasons to just
let it breathe,
let it breathe, let it play out, maybe even 1 more season. I believe that all these things wouldn't take like careful dissection to see. It would have been much more obvious.
And I think too, this is really one of those times where we actually needed exposition. Like the show Don't Tell had gone too far because it just seems too jarring. Like you have to infer way too much. And that was the reason why, I mean, like that guy said in the tweet storm, Martin actually took that extra time to write Feast for Crows so that these characters would be able to simmer and you'd be able to, you know, see how they got where they were. So it wouldn't feel so jarring when Tyrion shows up as like a beaten man. Yeah.
Well, and so on top of that, the other thing is I feel, and I think this has sort of been a theme for me and you, is like I feel there needs to be consequences. There needs to be stakes for these writers, and D&D have gotten away with stuff before. Too much.
Agreed, and that comes back to that whole George Lucas thing. It's like, no, you don't just get off the hook just because you're the ruler, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
And I want them to. I want there to be consequences so that we don't have this going forward. We just as consumers of movies and stories, we're just too forgiving. We're just like, oh, that was wonderful. You know, like I think it's important to hold these guys to a higher standard so that we can get better art.
Yeah, no, I agree. And so a lot of this criticism has a point to it, for sure. And it's just, I think that there is stuff to pick up in the rubble of King's Landing, as I said, like, for me, The Hound, that was one of the pieces that really worked for me. That's my favorite arc probably in the show. Again, it's just a person that didn't have a full redemption, but was able to. Some people thought it was too jarring when he's manages to turn Arya away, but I think this is, again, for Cersei and Arya, they're fighting the Game of Thrones. They're not looking for the end of the world. And even though, you know, Arya killed the Night King, like this is another level. Like this, Drogon has gotten into, you know, superpower, impossible to nerf mode. Nothing can stop him. So, I think that that surrounding with the Hound, and someone pointed this out. He says the same thing to Arya that he says to Sansa. He says that to Sansa at one point, like, look at me, little bird. And so he says the same thing, and this is, you know, one of the first times that the Hound actually emotes to Arya. I don't know, that worked for me. Their arc for me is like perfection. I could just have, you know, the Hound and Arya as a spinoff series and go back and watch like every minute that they spent. Yeah, I could watch that as a spinoff series. I think Jared's gonna get his ghost dream maybe as a spinoff series. I want the Hound and the Arya. Jared mentions that as far as Varys' character shift, that you know, at one point Tyrion was told by Varys that she was the best option, that Dany was the best option. Again, I think it comes back a lot to the problems with just the compression of time, that they tried to show it over time. I don't know, that for me, what worked was that one conversation they had when they first got back to Dragonstone, where Dany threatened to kill him, and Varys is like, "Look, I don't care who you are. Like, if you cross this line, I'm not on your side." So
yeah, but see, with a little more time, you could show how uncomfortable Jaime was there, how he didn't fit in anymore, how what he had done had destroyed his ability to live in peace.
Yeah, I agree.
And you could show Dany.
It's also abrupt. Yep.
Yeah, you could show like Varys like seeing her, and realizing it, and you know, just all these things.
Yeah, and that gets back. I mean, I really think Daniel Silverman on Twitter there. I just think that's fantastic. If you want to search it, if you just search Plotter versus Pantser Daniel Silverman, search that. Just fantastic. I feel like he's nailed it. Just taking it down to, and again, it's just great. I mean, that's one of the great things about our day and age, is that some person on Twitter can just like cut through all the BS. Like, oh, okay, this is why it went wrong, and also not be as I don't know, like scorched earth in terms of criticism. So I thought that was pretty good. Oh, there's one other thing I did want to mention. We're kind of running out of time here.
We ran out of time.
We ran out of time. All right, so for the people who've been talking about prophecies, okay, so this is Alt-Shift-X brought this up, and this is from Feast for Crows. Alt-Shift-X, if you want to really have a good introduction to the depth of Game of Thrones, Alt-Shift-X on YouTube is the guy you go to, because he's been making these videos all along, and he goes deep into the books, quotes from the books, and all this stuff. So this is his quote about prophecy. I'll try to do it in my best. What is the guy's name? He reads Game of Thrones by... I blanked on the dude's name, the guy who read the books. Born amidst salt and smoke, beneath a bleeding star. Okay, I'm sorry, I forgot to say the dude's name. Marwyn. He's one of the... he's like the maester that's talking to Sam, and a really smart dude. Really is well versed in things. Probably the most foul-mouthed priest you've ever heard. Born amidst salt and smoke, beneath the bleeding star. Know the prophecy. I know that prophecy, not that I would trust it. Gorgum of old Gis once wrote that a prophecy is like a treacherous woman. She pleasures you until her teeth snap shut and your moan turns to screams. That's the nature of prophecy. Prophecy will bite your prick off every time. Marwyn. That's Marwyn in Samwell 5 and A Feast for Crows. So everyone who's saying, well, the prophecy said this, the prophecy said that. George Martin didn't care about prophecy. Like, he didn't care about prophecy. Like, he doesn't believe prophecies. Like, these people, even when they see what's going to happen, they don't have the proper interpretation. And Melisandre is not a reputable source. Let's put it that way. Thanks again to Harsh Joshi for Keep Up With the Podcast. Another donation. Really appreciate it. If you discuss interesting topics, especially with the unique perspectives, I'm sure your audience will grow. Thank you again so much, Harsh, for all your support. Yes, we will get some updated sound equipment so we don't have people's ears breaking next week. All right. Any other thoughts there, Judah?
No, not that I can think of. No, I think we covered them.
All right. So my last little thing here. In my opinion, my own personal takeaway, and I'm not saying that this is Martin's intent, but for me, what I take away from Game of Thrones is that Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan is no longer a satisfactory metaphor for settling the dilemma of human safety and human liberty. So for those who aren't familiar, Thomas Hobbes wrote this treatise called Leviathan, in which he said that basically you needed a strong power in order to keep people from disputing with one another. You need a strong, benevolent dictator. You needed Leviathan. Interesting that he used Leviathan, a dragon. The dragon is a metaphor, just like the Ring of Power in Tolkien. Asymmetrical power structures, centralized control, and lack of government accountability poison the souls of those who wield them. Dragon sickness infects anyone who wields such power. Dany would never do that. She would not, but dragons would. And she has gone beyond thinking of them as pets, tools, soldiers, or servants. They are her children. The show and books take great pains to show just how stupid and malevolent people can be when family gets involved. Dany has been in full-blown Gollum my precious territory with her dragons for a long time, and unlike Eddard Stark, who would execute their own victims, Dany tells her children to do the dirty work for her in the most painful way possible. The writing this and last season has gotten worse and worse, to be sure, but Dany's turn is the least of the problems, aside from the way both dragons died, in my opinion. Just god-awful execution on both counts. And I just want to kind of end with this little blurb here, again, from David Crowther's History of England podcast. I will say this. You want to talk about dry history? There's a reason George R.R. Martin interpreted this history through Game of Thrones, because you go back and read all these names, they're like, what? Well, who is that? What? York was like, wait, I have to know 45 other peers in order to understand this complicated, like, political tapestry between York and Lancaster? Maybe one of the tragedies of these civil wars was that there are plenty of people acting to try to avoid conflict, but no one quite managed to rise above it. And I think that that is the problem with the Game of Thrones, applied to any sort of game, whether it's business, religion, government, money, family. If you're playing a Game of Thrones, if ultimately It's all about who gets to make the deciding power thing, who gets to be sitting on the Iron Throne. You're going to have trouble. And that's, I think, all for today. And I can't, and I already can't remember my tagline from last week, so I'll have to work on that. All right. Well, until next time, thanks everyone for tuning in. We will see you next week. Same time, 9 o'clock next week, or you want to do it early?
Yeah, 9 o'clock works if we want to keep it consistent. Yeah.
Good grief. Like, Harsh, you're making me embarrassed here. He's got another 50-pound donation. Oh, thank you so much, man. I cannot say enough. Thank you. He says, I must say your work is highly undervalued on YouTube. I found your vlogs and other videos from your time in India to be very valuable. I'm a British Indian, and I've learned a lot about India and Indian culture from your videos. Well, I do hope one day, again, to be able to talk more about Indian culture. I'm in the throes of another job right now, so it's few and far between. But yeah, I thank you for the support of the channel. Thank you for being willing to talk some kind of heady topics on a Saturday morning. Very much appreciate it. Until next week, everyone, y'all have a good week. I will be uploading last week's podcast in a couple hours onto iTunes. I'm a little behind on that one, but you will be able to hear that for your listening pleasure this week. And Godspeed. Thank you, Improbable One. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Bye.